Okay, welcome to our Week 5 online lecture for EDLD 8080. The agenda for this online session consists of 3 outcomes. The first one is to give you some suggestions on some trends that I noted in your problem statements and how we can address some of these trends for improvement across the problem statements that I read in my review of your second drafts. The other outcome is to just give you some clarity on the mini literature review overall assignment. I want you to be really clear on the expectations and deadlines, and I've gotten some clarity on that and how that's going to work across the 3 professors that you will be submitting it to, one of them being me. And then lastly, I'm going to do some teaching as promised around the literature review basics as an academic genre, and we'll take time to actually even dive into an example. Okay, so before proceeding with content, I just wanted to let you know that this slide presentation is available as a link in your Week 5 agenda, which is in the course materials in Blackboard. You'll note as I go through some of the PowerPoint, some of the formatting gets a little funny in VoiceThread, so I just want you to know that the well-formatted version of this is available as a link in the Week 5 agenda, which is in Blackboard course materials. All right, so based on my review of the classes, the cohort's second draft, I have some tips as you engage in the revision of your problem statements. I know that you're working on a draft and incorporating the revisions I suggested in preparation to submit a third draft to Dr. Orfilio. So I want to remind everyone, we mentioned this in Week 4, the need for a very direct, bold, and succinct introductory sentence to the first paragraph. Remembering that this first paragraph to this first component of the broader paper is actually the intro to the entire paper. So spending a whole paragraph meandering and kind of setting the stage in advance of just claiming, identifying, and naming the problem becomes a little problematic, because remember, you have the rest of the paper to sort of unpack the problem. And so you want this first sort of introductory sentence to this first paragraph to be strong, to be bold, succinct, and actually be sort of the nugget of the issue. The other thing that I wanted to address is that there was a lot of variance in terms of the length of problem statements, and not that there are any hard and fast rules around this. I'm going to say a good sort of working number is to think about 2 paragraphs, 1 to 2 paragraphs, half a page to a page, where you are really staying focused on the problem statement. Remember, this is where you identify and define the problem. You have lots of other places coming up in this broader paper to elaborate and unpack the problem. But here you want 1 to 2 focused paragraphs of a really high quality problem statement where someone knows what the rest of this paper is going to cover. So make sure that you stick to that and not use this introductory problem statement section. Some of you had problem statements that were 2 pages long, and you'll see I advise that some of your content wasn't appropriate for the problem statement component or subsection of the broader paper. Just a gentle reminder to look back to session 4. I closed our face-to-face session with some advice and recommendations on how to use what I called cohesive devices. These cohesive devices will help with you improving your flow and your connectivity of ideas across sentences, sentence to sentence within one paragraph, and then of course paragraph to paragraph within the subsections of your paper. So start really applying that within the problem statement. If you can insert some of those suggested cohesive devices, that'll help with your new revised version. The fourth point I want to make is that some of the problem statements were void of references to literature. And a habit as an academic writer coming to this space of doctoral work is that you want to remember that you want to allude to literature, refer to literature wherever you can. If the idea or concept is from an article that you read, you want to give that author credit. You either use the parenthetical citation at the end, or you might begin your sentences with according to author X, as I modeled in session 4, in order to make sure that you're bolstering your problem statement by showing that some of these concepts are coming from current research that's in the field. Remember, we don't want your pure opinion on the problem. We want you to start sort of building your argument around this problem by showing that you're pulling from other authors' work. I want to advocate for the elimination of statements like, this study will. Some of the problem statements amongst the group started with "this study will," or the second paragraph in the problem statement started with "this study will." And I think that may have been prompted by looking at some of these sample dissertations that are actually complete dissertations. And often in chapter 1, they will insert paragraphs once the study is completed to say what the study is actually addressing. We are not at that phase in the work. And so I'm going to ask that you remove statements like "this study will," and you stay focused on the problem within the problem statement subsection. We don't have a design study yet. We're starting to envision what a study might look like. There's a lot of work that needs to get done before we can actually get into study design. And so you're not quite sure what the study will address. And so what you want to focus your energy on, instead of the envisioning of the study, you want to focus on getting a very clearly articulated problem statement. The last thing that I would like to let you know is that some of the content that was included in the problem statements of some of the students in the cohort, I made the suggestion that you start to shift some of that content to the subsequent section, which is the background of the problem. There'll be more details on that as I review the expectation and proposed outline for the entire paper, but just remember that this is the succinct subsection of the paper where you just clearly articulate and define the problem. It's not the entire paper. And so you have lots of opportunities to give more background on the problem and demonstrate how much you've read and learned about the problem later on in the paper. Okay, so now it's time to get some clarity on the overall assignment, the mini literature review. So I know that after I saw you last Thursday during our week 4 session, you had your class with Dr. Porfilio. Dr. Porfilio had sent out that original guideline sheet that we had been working from and sort of queuing up to around the expectations of the paper. I want to bring some clarity that I've been able to attain over the course of the last few days in order to direct you on how to move forward on this assignment. First of all, Porfilio is reviewing your problem statement, which presents another revision opportunity before your final submission. Hopefully you read my comments on your draft 2, which was improved from your draft 1 that you shared with a peer. Draft 2, I reviewed, provided you some feedback from improvement, and now you have the opportunity to submit a third draft to Dr. Porfilio, who is likely to then give you feedback. That is so exciting that you were able to attain three revision cycles, or engage in 3 revision cycles in advance of what will be in your final paper, right? Because this is a very important part of the paper. It's where you present the problem. It is your foundation. The submission of this revised draft to Porfilio has been set for Friday, on July 15th, is what I learned. And like I said, use his feedback to improve the problem statement that you're going to include as the opening section of your final submission. Now, what I came to learn is that the dates that were presented on that original assignment guideline sheet were simply just a guide. It was intended to help you keep on pace and kind of help you pace out completion of the subcomponents of the paper. Your other professors, Dr. Porfilio and Dr. Reynolds, will actually not be reviewing any more of the subsections of the paper. Only Dr. Porfilio will review this first section, the problem statement. But besides that, all you have to worry about is my deadlines and the final draft that's due Sunday, August the 28th to all 3 of us. With that being very clear now, we can move into this last bullet. I want you to use a tool that I just created. It is a little bit more flushed out than the guideline sheet that Dr. Porfilio distributed at the beginning of the summer quarter. I want you to use my new Lit Review outline template, which is linked in that week 5 agenda and resources, to learn about the details of every subsection. I did not provide deadlines for every subsection because I think in the upcoming slides, deadlines will become very transparent and clear. You're going to be working between now and when I see you on Saturday 7/23 on, you've got your problem statement, the background of the problem, the setting, the purpose, and then your literature review. You're going to really zone in on the literature review, which is really the meat of the paper and what we want to learn how to do well at the end of this summer quarter. It sets you up to be successful for the remainder of year 1. And so on Saturday the 23rd, you're going to come prepared with the meat of the paper, showing that you've been reading and starting to write about the literature articles that you're curating in your literature review analysis sheet. More to come on the next slides. Okay, so the literature review outline template that I was referring to, that actually um, fleshes out in more detail every subcomponent of this mini literature review paper, which is your culminating product for the summer quarter, submitted to all 3 professors, is included as a link in the week 5 agenda, as I stated on the previous slide. The guideline sheet is similar to what Dr. Porfilio provided at the onset of the quarter, just with a little bit more detail and explanation for each of the subsections. So I'm going to ask that you use this as a guide. And I have included some general markers around what is the suggested length for each of the sections. So it's really important that you take some time this week and start looking at this and really starting to sketch out the development of your work now that you have got a more revised and stronger problem statement, which serves as the anchor for the rest of this paper. So I'm going to take a few moments just to kind of explain the outline, although I think it's fairly self-explanatory. There are a total of 6 subsections to the mini literature review. The first section we spent some time on. It's the problem statement. And you now have 2 revisions working on a 3rd revised draft of the problem statement, which again is the foundation and the anchor for all the work moving forward. This is in unequivocal terms, what is the issue? State it, identify it, and try and do it succinctly, allude to literature where possible. The next subsection, and by the way, you should have subheadings aligned to this outline or list of subsections. The next section is the transition into the background of the problem. The background of the problem sets the social, political, and economic context of the problem. It's also the opportunity for you to maybe discuss some of the historical background of this issue, right? And so think of the various social, political, economic dimensions that are influencing this issue and might actually serve as some of the root causes or contributors as to why this issue has emerged in public education and has now become a social justice or equity issue in the field. The 3rd subsection, you then transition from the background into the purpose. This is sort of the so what. Why should we have a moral imperative? Why should we have urgency around this issue? So you want to spend about half a paragraph, now that you've done some reading, coupled with your own sort of personal passion, coupled with your own professional experience as to why this is an issue and why we should have some urgency in closing the gaps in the field that are connected to this issue for students. The 4th section is the setting subsection, and as described in more detail in that tool that I presented on the last slide, the setting is where you want to set the stage. What is the context that this problem is situated within? You can discuss it at a district, state, and or national level. You might be zoning in on one organizational level. It might be the district level. Or you might say, I want to sort of paint how this picture cuts across the 3 levels and sort of describe the setting across all 3. Either one works. But this is a description of the context that this issue sort of is nested in. And what is it about that context that is actually creating a social injustice where kids are underserved? The 5th subsection of this paper is the literature review. This is the meat of the paper. As you can see, it's 6 pages of the paper. You're doing most of your work here because we're asking you to read 5 to 8 articles. You cannot produce this next subsection if you haven't read those articles. And so this is to push you to start to become an expert on the problem. And so you can only do that by reading, reviewing, and writing about current research that's out there. We'll spend some time later in this online lecture to learn about some of the basics on how we write about other people's work. But this is the meat of your work. And I'm asking, right, hopefully that you have moved from the problem statement, you're starting to flesh out some of these other subsections, background, the problem, purpose, and setting, which for the most part are fairly short, right? That you're then moving towards having the literature, your 5 to 8 articles read, so that you can start drafting an initial draft of the literature review. My expectation is that you will come with a draft of this subsection, prepared, ready for our face-to-face session on 7/23, which is about 10 days away, so that we can engage in a critical friends workshop around this subsection. Okay? After the literature review comes another fairly short section where you will provide essentially a bulleted list of some of the possible research questions. And many of you are going to be perfectionists and think that this is the question of my potential research study that I'm going to design 18 months down the road. But this is just meant to be formative. It's the initial space where you're saying, what are some research questions that we could ask now that I've developed some knowledge around this important social justice issue in education? You don't need to have these prepared for the 723 session. We'll actually engage in a little workshop, what I'm going to call question development workshop, as an agenda item on 723. But know that this is the following section that will come after you've done the review of the literature. And then, of course, the paper has to have a conclusion where you sort of reiterate the social justice issue and kind of tie up all of these components that you've spent some time working on. A little bit of that redundancy that I alluded to will emerge in the conclusion, but that's okay. That's where you just kind of want to repackage everything for your readers, put a bow on it, and articulate some next steps based on the work that was done through this mini literature review. Okay, so hopefully now we have some clarity on the assignment and what your work needs to be over the course of the next 10 days between now and 723, and then of course beyond that to finish the culminating product. So now we're going to move into some direct teaching around literature reviews and how we begin to do that. You're going to be doing a lot of this type of writing throughout the course of your year one for the various assignments that you'll be submitting in your coursework, which always, for the most part, entails some review of literature that you're engaging in. So this is a very important sort of year one skill that we're working on. So, a literature review, just let's start with some basic definitions. A literature review may constitute a chapter or a dissertation, or sometimes it may be a self-contained review. And I think I've mentioned this in some of our face-to-face lectures, where some authors actually do sort of what we call a meta-analysis, curate a lot of literature that's out there, and write an article where they're actually reviewing the current literature that's out there on a particular issue, for example. We're prepping, right? We're prepping in this first year to build your literature review that hopefully will come to serve you well in a dissertation chapter, usually chapter 2, right, of a dissertation. In either case, the purpose of a literature review is the following. It's a synthesis of arguments of multiple authors to prove a point about a specific idea, right? Typically, for you, it's going to be around this problem or issue, the problem statement. It's also a place where we describe the relationship of each work to the others. And we try to resolve conflicts amongst seemingly contradictory studies. And so in the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about how you do that. But essentially, a literature review can often present the debate in the field. And it's talking about how different bodies of research relate to one another around this topic, where they are similar and where they're different. This last bullet is absolutely critical. And that's really what we're looking for in your formative literature review for this assignment, because you are only reading 5 to 8 articles, but it should be based, once you've read 5 to 8 articles on this problem, hopefully we're starting to see a demonstration of your ability to understand and critique the literature in the field. Now, one big concept to consider when you are starting to review literature and write about other people's work is that within a well-done literature review, you're summarizing the work that's out there in the field on this issue, but you want to take your writing to a level of actual synthesis, right? And what do I mean by that? What I mean is that a first initial tendency of students who are engaging in their first draft of a literature review, as they put articles together or curate articles together on an issue, is that they want to go dedicate a paragraph or two where they summarize article number 1. Then they take another paragraph or two to summarize article number 2, et cetera, right? And that is not really how we want to structure a high quality literature review. It's not where we summarize one and then move on to the next and summarize the next piece and summarize the next piece. Like I said on the previous slide, you want to be discussing the relationship or the interconnectivity or the debate and the contradiction between these 5 to 8 articles that you have read in this initial draft of your literature review. And so I want to caution you to not engage in what often, I know even for me, but what is our natural intuition. We think, oh, okay, I read these 5 to 8 articles. I'm supposed to demonstrate that I'm becoming an expert on the issue in the field. I'm supposed to demonstrate that I actually read articles on the issue. So let me just take a couple paragraphs for each of these articles and summarize the key points of each article. That is not what we're looking for. What we're looking for is for you to, definitely dedicate time to each of the articles. By the end of me reading these pages, 5 to 6 pages, I should have, knowledge on the 5 to 8 articles, get familiar with them. But what I'm actually doing is presenting concepts and sort of arguments or concepts and big ideas that emerged as I read these 5 to 8 articles, and using the literature to sort of, provide evidence and make claims about some of these big concepts and ideas. And at times also show, the similarities across the studies and the research, and the contradictions across the 5 to 8 pieces that you read around the problem. And so I want you to kind of think about that as you start summarizing versus synthesizing, and trying to move more towards that synthesis zone. You know, initially, the first time you do this, you might be more on the summarizing zone, and we'll have to work through processes of feedback and revision to get you more in the synthesis zone. But I thought it was important to plant that seed early as you start to do some of the drafting and writing of your literature review. Okay, so in this sort of meat of the mini literature review paper, right, which is the literature review subsection, the literature review component that I'm lecturing on now, it's a reminder that 5 to 8 articles is the expectation. I just want to sort of foreshadow a little bit and look ahead while we also deal with it now. In these 5 to 6 pages of the literature review subsection, you're going to engage in a discussion, right, about what you've learned through this first wave of articles that you've reviewed on this issue. But know that through year 1, through a variety of other assignments that come through the other courses in the fall, the winter, and the spring, you're going to be expanding your list of articles, right? And this is just your sort of initial step. And so 5 to 8 for now works, but as you're doing your searching and your reading, it's a nice idea to kind of maybe just dump in a folder some of the articles that you think might even expand your knowledge further, that you might sort of run out of time to read this summer. So I just kind of want to plant that seed as well as we move ahead. Another thing, because right now you're just doing 5 to 8, which is pretty manageable and doable as an entry point, but I suggested that you take some time, maybe in August, in advance of starting your fall quarter, if you can schedule some time to go to the library and schedule some time with a librarian at the library, where you could get some one-on-one support on how to effectively use some of the library search tools there, because your repertoire of articles is definitely going to have to grow. We're going to be looking by the end of year 1 for you to have something about 25 to 30 articles. So just another reminder, as we continue to discuss literature review, you got that literature review analysis sheet. Some of you are using it in the template that I provided. In week 4, we talked about if you want to put it in a Google sheet or an Excel sheet, if that's more helpful for you to manipulate, that's fine too. But this tool should be a space where you start to kind of put a working list of these articles that are important and related to your topic. So just want to put that reminder out there. I will be collecting these towards the end of the quarter. It is, I think, 10 points of your grade to just make sure that you used the tool as evidence that you really engaged in that curation of literature process that is so critical to moving forward. Now, another suggestion as you get this work done around the literature review is the idea of actually outlining your paper. And particularly outlining this literature review subsection, because it's probably the most complicated and the one that's going to present the most challenge. And it's a meat, right? It's the biggest, it's the largest sort of in length, and it's the meat of your paper as I've described throughout these slides. I originally had this as a required assignment and I removed it. And so I just want to suggest it as an optional idea to think about before you write the subsection, just using an outline strategy where you literally maybe think about, are there subsections to the literature review, or what are some big ideas that you are going to lay out across these 5 to 6 subsections, and then, what are some big ideas that you're going to lay out across these 5 to 6 pages, is what I meant, and then start to outline, like, what are the articles that support those big ideas, and how do they support those big ideas. And so I just want to suggest that before you dive into drafting that initial draft for Saturday, 7/23, that you consider outlining as a strategy. It really can be helpful. Now, what are some of the hints for writing a high-quality literature review? Here are some ideas I want you to consider. So, one way of discussing other people's literature is to distinguish between another author's opinion, their interpretation, what we call their assertion. So you're reading articles out there by other authors, and they are loaded with those authors' assertions. Okay, and so highlighting other authors' assertions is one way to discuss some of the research that's out there in the field. And then you can also, right, sort of coupled with that, there's this concept of assertion of other authors' work. Then you can also think about highlighting other authors' evidence. What are some of the findings from other studies? And so that's another way to sort of frame sentences where you discuss other people's literatures, assertions and or evidence and findings from other people's work. Another framing tool for writing about other people's literature is this idea of compare and contrasting studies. How are articles related, right? Where are they similar? Where are they different? Where are there tensions around some of these ideas? Where are there high levels of accord and agreement or cohesion across some of the ideas that are emerging as you read the research that's out there? Really capture in your literature review what the debate in the field is. So that's some framing tool that you can use, right? Lastly, one thing that I like to do as I prepare for writing a literature review, and I found this to be helpful, is just get these printed copies that you have, and maybe organize them by their methodology. Maybe put in one pile the 3 or 4 articles that use a qualitative method, and then put 3 or 4 articles in another pile that use a quantitative method, and use that discussion or use the methodology as a framing tool. What were some of the trends that emerged amongst the qualitative studies? What were some of the trends that emerged amongst the quantitative studies? Were there similarities where they complemented each other across these qualitative versus quantitative studies? Were there differences across the qualitative versus quantitative studies grounded in these 2 categories of methods? And so that's another way to sort of frame other people's work as you draft these 5 to 6 pages. Okay, some more preparatory hints for producing those 5 to 6 pages of your literature review. Sometimes what's helpful, and I think I've said this across our face-to-face sessions, you're on a dual track agenda as you're reading articles. You're looking at content and you're looking at structure as well, because you want to learn that formula of academic writing. You might have an article or 2 in your repertoire of articles that is an article that is actually a literature review article. Sometimes it's helpful to look at those articles, other people's review of the literature, to get some of the structure that I'm talking about. Even subsections of others' research articles that aren't lit review articles, often in the beginning, right, will offer a brief review of other people's work on the matter before they go into the description of their study. And so, you want to look at some of these examples, either articles that are full research or literature review articles, or the subsection of articles where they talk about other people's literature before they dive into the details of their own. If you do look at literature review examples, just be mindful of the fact, remember, they are reviewing other people's literature, and so they have an arsenal of articles that they're citing to draw their overall conclusions. It's just a different type. It's a different type of writing in a way. So I just want you to have awareness around that. But nonetheless, look at these articles that you have come across. Look at some of you in our class readings, and try and notice, like, did this writer what framing tool did they use? Did they use assertion and evidence? Did they use comparing and contrasting? Did they categorize quantitative findings versus qualitative findings? So, in preparation before you go into production mode around how you're going to write about your 5 to 8 pieces, notice how other people are doing it and what framing tools they're using. Organize your notes and how you're possibly annotating some of the studies that you are reading, under each of the subtopics. How are you going to use these pieces across your entire paper? And then if you think about the subsection of the literature review, do you need to sort of have some subcategories under the literature review, under big ideas that emerge once you finish the 5 to 8 pieces? So, think about that. Again, I'm going to go back to suggesting that outline as a way to prep yourself. And then another sort of quick and dirty way to prep for the literature review is for you to look at your literature analysis tool sheet that I also referred to in an earlier slide, and ask yourself, look at the findings column, right, where you summarize key findings. How do they each contrast? How do they relate? What are the similarities? Are there several that make the same point? So that's a big point. That's something you want to speak to. And are there others that extend, refine, or contrast the point in a unique way compared to the other 6 or 7 authors that you read or research articles that you reviewed for the purposes of this assignment? Okay, now on this slide, we're actually going to look at another student of mine who's farther along in the process. We looked at her example of a problem statement. Now we're going to look at a paragraph, a couple paragraphs of part of the literature review section of her Qual 1, just to sort of notice some things, and also just to kind of look ahead as well, because some of the work that you're doing is the foundation in the initial phase. It'll be more, you'll elaborate more on it, you're going to expand on it, but it does sort of evolve into the culminating product of the end of your first year, which is your Qual 1. And it all starts with this initial draft of a literature review that starts on 5 to 8 articles, which we then build and expand upon. So based on some of the things that I stated, you could see here, this is approximately, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 paragraphs of a section of a literature review. It's not the entire literature review. So I just want to highlight some of the things that were discussed in the previous slides in the lecture. So let me get the yellow highlighter here. So, in this first paragraph, the problem here that this student is dealing with is the inequities caused by foundation funding to close the economic gap within school districts, right? And so she is, in her literature review, she has various big ideas that she came across the 25 to 30 articles that she read. And one of those big ideas is community capacity and equity, right? And so she's using this section of her literature review to kind of discuss this community capacity and equity idea. So she starts this paragraph by defining what for her is a key term, right, in this section of her literature review, her big idea being around community capacity. So she says, the definition of community capacity focuses on the level to which the community takes responsibility for educating all their children equally. And notice she is using Chaskin's definition, not great with this pencil yet, and she's been referring to Chaskin throughout this broader paper, right? So I'm at this point as a reader familiar with Chaskin, but Chaskin's work is going to get really elevated here in this subsection because Chaskin talks a lot about the community capacity concept, which is important to her as she builds her argument around this problem. Then she continues, many districts do not have a shared vision about what should be funded in schools. School district leadership experiences various philosophies within parent group organizations about how schools should collaborate across how schools should collaborate across schools. So, within a system, schools collaborating with other schools to understand what each other's needs is what she's referring to. The research indicates that the controversy often centers on who is considered in the community, right? So this is kind of her next big idea, elaboration of the community capacity concept. And then she brings in a quote. She says, the arguments on both sides of the discussion were grounded in different conceptions of the moral community. This is another landmark author she has been studying. And she's introducing a tension, a discussion, a debate around this issue of foundation funding within school districts. And so here comes the debate, right? Often schools within a district operate in silos with little to no community connection between and across schools. Chaskin, notice that she elevates Chaskin and tells us, she uses an active verb with him and says, Chaskin, the other author, introduces the concept of community capacity and its importance of establishing collectively held values, norms, and visions for a community. She takes it right out of the literature. And we've got some formatting issues that are emerging here, but try and ignore them. However, Reddy, who is another big researcher around this problem that she's focusing on, he says something else. The concept of community can be a useful tool in some instances, like the case of school fundraising. It can actually inhibit the realization of justice instead of promoting it. So she's presenting these two landmark authors' insights on this big idea that she elevated, right, amongst all the ideas that sort of were generated as she read 25 to 30 articles. She's spending some time fleshing out this idea of community capacity, and she's introduced us to Chaskin and Reddy, who are kind of landmark authors around this angle of it, right? In most districts, she explains a little bit more, and then she highlights that, you know, through her reading, there's limited research has been done on the connectivity across school districts and its impact on the equitable distribution of fundraising dollars, right? So she's also telling us a little bit about the limitations, and then she uses another author, Henderson Mapp, to also elaborate on this definition of community in relationship to this topic of foundation, fundraising, extra dollars for schools, and how they either close gaps or actually widen gaps within school districts as organizations. This definition, she continues, right? This definition of community implies that connections across school extend far beyond the walls of the schools. And she uses another quote. These relationships in turn build power, connecting people in their interest with a shared purpose for taking action. And then she says, drawing on the social capital within urban communities and their interconnectedness, these relationships can build power to make change. And she's now cited another author. So I'm just using this as an example of how this big idea of community capacity has emerged for her as she reviewed literature, community capacity, and its connection to equity. You know, there's some improvements, of course, that can be made always in terms of maybe how paragraphs are structuring, and maybe we could do some improvements around the cohesive devices. But nonetheless, there's a unifying through line here that the big idea is the community capacity and the equity concept in relation to the school funding and school foundation extra dollar issue. But she has brought out the big idea and then introduced several authors. She's used some quotes, some claims of authors to elaborate on that idea, as opposed to maybe doing what might have been an initial attempt, or what a lot of students tend to do in the beginning, which is, this is how Reddy defines community capacity. This is how Chaskin defines it. And maybe here's how a third author does it and summarizes it. But she's actually done this, a good job at showing the relationship across these authors and how they're connected around this concept, and introducing how the different authors bring an angle to the table around the issue. And so, that's one way of applying one example, a small example. We could probably go through many. And you'll get some of that feedbacks in your drafts that you submit on how to build these literature reviews that aren't just pure summarizations of the big ideas, but rather there's the big idea that emerged across the pieces, and how the various authors can be used to elaborate on it, flesh it out, introduce the debate in the field by using the evidence that other authors have come up with based on study. So it's a lot to digest, it's a lot to understand, but remember, you're in the early phases of it, and this is a So this slide concludes week 5 of our online video lecture. Just a reminder, I always try and include everything in our agenda, so make sure that in the week 5 agenda, there's in the course materials section of Blackboard for EDLD 8080, that you pull up the week 5 agenda. You'll see the link to this lecture, you'll see the link to the PowerPoint slides, the link to the assignment outline that I have fleshed out for you, and then there's the list to try and keep you on track between now and when I see you on 7/23 for our last face-to-face session. So it's really hard to believe that 5 out of the 6 summer sessions we have accomplished once you're done with this video lecture. And I look forward to seeing you all on Saturday the 23rd for our last face-to-face, where we'll do a nice amount of work to set you up to spend some days in August really fleshing out your mini literature review as your culminating assignment for the 3 courses you're taking this summer. With that, I'm signing off, and thank you so much for taking the time to learn online with me this week.